What's up, everybody? Welcome in. Another day has gone by in this trial. It was a bit of a clunky day because, in case you didn't notice, interpreters were used quite a bit today, but not always. And that's always interesting. And people had a lot of questions about that. Like, why do they have interpreters if the witnesses can speak English? Why, if the witnesses are answering half the questions in English and half in another language, do they really need an interpreter? Is that fair? Is that how it's supposed to be? Well, we're going to talk about that. We're going to play some clips of why exactly some people need interpreters and if the lawyers have any strategy behind using interpreters in trial, which is obviously very obvious to the jury and it doesn't just go unnoticed. And if there's any strategy to that, how is it usually taken by the jury? So today there were Spanish speaking witnesses. I think they were all Spanish. I actually am not positive. But the defense wanted to work their witnesses in as well while the interpreter was there, with the state's witnesses calling them out of order, which did happen today, which means the defense asked questions first and direct. The state gets to cross-examine them. So that's what we're gonna focus on for most of today's video. If you guys haven't already, hit that like button. Liking the video lets everybody know that wants to watch some breakdowns of this case and this trial. They can come here for those breakdowns, ask questions, get in the chat, talk to you guys about it, share your opinions, and try to learn something from this process and this trial, and whether or not we think this is a self-defense case. I'll talk a little bit at the end of the video of where I stand at this point as well. Also, make sure you subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. So we're going to bring in the defendant's buddy who was there with his crew that day. And a lot of people said it really seemed like he had selective memory. He remembered most of the stuff the defense asked him, but not a lot of stuff the state asked him. When he was cross-examined, he was impeached multiple times about what he told law enforcement. And this guy probably didn't really need a translator, is what some people said. And what I'll tell you is, anytime it's even close, we get a translator. We don't want to have any issues. We don't want to have any issues with jurors. Sometimes we get translators for jurors. Sometimes we get translators for witness. Sometimes jurors don't sit on the jury if it's going to be really technical and hard and the translator's not going to be able to translate some of the words we think we're going to be able to, or we're going to use. So that could be somebody that gets struck for cause potentially. We get translators for clients sometimes. So translators are not unusual in the courtroom, but are they always necessary? I think you always err on the side of caution. And if you think it might be necessary, the answer is yes. Same thing with depositions. We have had depositions where I feel like the client does pretty fine in English, but they don't feel comfortable. They say there are certain things I don't know. I would feel more comfortable if a translator was there. And guess what? We get a translator and we get it every time. And we're going to hear this witness explain exactly why he thinks he needs a translator and how that can come into play in this case. So let's take a listen.
Understood. When you spoke to the police, was there a Spanish interpreter there?
No.
So Ernesto here got impeached a couple times during his cross-examination when the state was asking him questions about where were you? You said this, you said somebody pointed this or did that, picking apart parts of his story, which obviously were beneficial for the defendant. But he said, I don't remember. I don't remember saying that. Maybe I did say that. I don't know if it was this point. They showed him a clip of the video. He said, I don't know if it was before this or after this, or if he just couldn't see it in the angle of the camera. And he was a little bit evasive with some of their questions, but I thought he did his best. And I thought, he just didn't know certain things he didn't know. And, a lot of people's memories have faded over 2 years in this case on both sides. But why have a translator at trial when it's close? Yes, you want to get things right, but also if there's going to be some differences in his story he's going to tell today than the story that he told police that day, which same thing with Mr. Mew, the defendant, blame it on a translator. They didn't have one there. We have one here today. Clearly we need one. We've got one in court for all these witnesses. Why didn't they have a translator at the police station when they were taking statements in something as important as this case? So when you talk about in jury's instructions to the jury at the end of the case, they get to determine a witness's credibility and which statement is true and what you can believe or not believe when they take the stand and testify to you today. Usually if they're impeached over and over again in a prior statement to law enforcement, you'll argue that prior statement to law enforcement is actually more reliable, but not here. The defense has a very good argument as to why that prior statement to law enforcement was not in fact more reliable, because there was no translator there like you saw he had throughout the entirety of his testimony. But how does he deal with the fact that he answered some questions in English? Let's take a listen.
Sometimes when you've spoken today, you've answered in English. Agreed?
Sí.
Yes.
You fair to say your preferred language is Spanish.
Español.
Spanish.
You know some English.
Sí.
Yes.
If you wanted to communicate something really important and make sure you were accurate, would you say it in Spanish, or would you say it in English, or would you say it in some other language?
Español.
Spanish.
Why?
Porque hay muchas palabras en inglés que tienen diferentes significados
Because there are many words in English that
y
have different
a la hora
meanings.
de uno contestar, puede ser que la respuesta no sea correcta.
And when one answers, maybe the answer is not the correct one.
And as you know, that's true. There's a lot of differences and definitions and how you say things, some words that don't translate. Absolutely true. And it's come up in legal cases a lot. Some legalese, some medical terms can be very difficult to translate sometimes. But then he adds in there, sometimes it's just very different. Sometimes things can even be wrong when you say them in the wrong language or when I try to do it in English, which again goes back to help. I'm going to back it up just a little so we can hear that last part again. If there's any inconsistencies in what he told the cops that day because there was no translator there.
Puede ser que la respuesta no sea correcta.
And when one answers, maybe the answer is not the correct one.
Maybe the answer is not the correct one when it's done in English and I prefer Spanish.
Also, when you hear words, is it easier for you to understand the words spoken to you when the words spoken to you are in Spanish rather than in English?
Sí.
Yes.
You answered some questions about your knowledge about your friend Nick being from Romania. I want to ask you about that, okay?
So later on, and we're not going to listen to his whole testimony, obviously, because we're really focusing in on this translation and the interpreter being in the courtroom today. And what else is really interesting is the interpretation and all of that is also transcribed and put into the record. And if things are said wrong or it's interpreted wrong, that can become an appellate issue. It's very interesting with an interpreter. It does make it more difficult, clearly. But later on, he also says stuff like he remembers what he sees better than what he hears. So there's a lot of qualification going on from the defense with this witness to try and say, yeah, his testimony wasn't perfect, but here are all the reasons why you should still find him reliable and credible as a witness for the defense. All right. The next part we are going to cover on how interpreters affect this process is the rule of sequestration. It came to someone's attention that some of these witnesses may have been watching some of the trial and would know what the cross-examination is going to be like from the prosecutor. Prosecutor has a problem with that. And then we find out maybe the rule of sequestration and how it was explained did not have a translated version. So the judge is going to call all of these witnesses in with the interpreter and have the interpreter translate that they are not allowed to watch this trial and confirm with them that they understand it. So let's watch how the judge does this.
Your Honor, the question from the interpreters, we're just going to interpret right next to them.
We'll just do sequential interpretation. Welcome back, everyone. We have Ms. Costanza. There she is. Ms. Torres. Mr. Ruiz Leyva. He left. Okay. Ms. Ruiz Leyva. Mr. Torres Chaguez. And Ariel. What is your last name? Okay, Ariel Chaguez. At the beginning of the trial, I told the attorneys to tell all of the witnesses that they were not to discuss their testimony with other witnesses. I also told the attorneys to tell the witnesses that they were not allowed to watch the trial, either in person or on the internet or television, because we didn't want the witnesses to conform their testimony to what they hear from the others. I was told that one or more of you may be watching trial while you're sitting in the hallway.
Just streaming it right there on their phone from the courthouse.
I invited you in today so that I could explain to you personally that you may not do so, because we want to preserve your memories about what happened from July 2022, and we don't want your memories to be tainted by something that you may see or hear about this trial. But please, as long as you're needed as witnesses, do not talk about the case with each other or with other witnesses. Please do not watch any TV or internet accounts of this trial? Will you all do that? Excellent. They've all answered in the affirmative. Thank you, everyone. You can go back to the hallway.
So basically, he also kind of gave them the benefit of the doubt because of the translation issues that might be there that he may not have given to somebody who speaks English, and saying that maybe they didn't understand the gravity of it being a court order that you're not allowed to do this. He didn't really come down hard on the state or the defense, that it was, their fault for making sure there wasn't a translation there, which I thought was interesting as well. And definitely something that's affected by interpreters and people speaking different languages.
Ariel, can you stay? We're going to call you next, so you may as well just wait in.
Need to address outside the presence of the jury?
No, Judge.
No. All right, let's bring them in.
I believe he also said he was going to let him handle this on cross, the state, and maybe even ask him if he's been watching part of the trial. So we'll have to wait and see if that happens. I haven't watched that part of the trial just yet. So ultimately today we heard from a bunch of different witnesses that had similar stories that can be cross-checked by the video. And once you have the video, it's hard to disagree with it. Which why in a lot of cases, if people have videos, they try to hide it, get statements before the video. In this case, they talk to law enforcement before seeing the video. Some of them have never seen the video with interpreters. It was a little clunky, but I do think that the defendant's witnesses talked enough about him being scared, how many people there were versus just him and what they saw. Yes, it did seem like they were biased in his favor, which is not something that's unreasonable to think from people that were your friends, that were there with you. Same with the victims groups. Those people were all going to be biased in favor of the witnesses. Everybody's memory of a situation like this is going to be a little colored by the bias in the group that they are with. So I thought it was just interesting to do a few minutes on why interpreters or how they affect trial, why it's so important. It can be difficult for a jury to understand exactly what's being asked and assessed. So I think it's usually not as powerful as some other testimonies. So you have to be real careful if your star witness needs an interpreter, and you need to go slow with it and make sure that the translation is correct and that the jury's understanding and things are going slow. I also don't love how the last witness that, we talked about answered some in English, some in Spanish. I would usually try to prefer and say, hey, just answer it all in Spanish so it all comes through the interpreter, so it's cohesive and consistent and everybody can follow along. It doesn't always work out like that, but that's usually what we want. So I promise to tell you kind of where I stood at the end of this case, right? Or at the end of this video, I should say right now. And I think the state is doing a good job presenting the evidence. I think it's incredibly sad. I think that they're presenting a lot of emotional testimony. The loss of life and injuries and effect that it's had on so many people is so sad. It seems like it got escalated way too far, and none of this should have happened. All that being said, if I'm on the jury and there's an overweight, out of shape, quadruple bypass patient alone with 10, 11, 12, 13 people yelling, making fun of, harassing, encircling, getting in his business, that's usually a recipe for a good self-defense argument. I also think that some of the testimony has been fuzzy as to whether or not he hit the female, whether or not that is enough of an aggressor or starter of the fight, initiator of the fight, whether or not that initiation or pushing, shoving, hitting, punching, whatever he did to the female, allegedly, if that deserved such a response that was potentially going to give him great bodily harm. I definitely feel like there is enough there for a reasonable person in his position to think that he was in danger of great bodily harm or death, being pushed, punched, kicked, shoved into the water. They talked about how shallow the water. You can drown in very shallow water, unfortunately, especially if you're knocked out, punched, or stabbed. People can say, of course, I understand how this ended. But I think it's an easy argument that he was in reasonable fear of bodily harm or imminent death. The question is, was he the aggressor? I think that's where the state has trying to hit their argument, and I don't feel like they have proved that beyond a reasonable doubt yet to me. So that's why I would still be leaning not guilty at this point, but there's still more to come. And also, I think the state has not fully gone into his post altercation action, which can show consciousness of guilt or consciousness that even he didn't think it was self-defense. So I want to hear more of that. It doesn't change the self-defense fact, but it may change the way I think the jury is looking at it. Additionally, I've seen some charts on different channels about the makeup of the jury. There's a 90 something-year-old on the jury, 3 people in their 70s, and another couple people in their 50s and 60s. So an older leaning jury. So they're going to resonate and relate more to the defendant in this case than the victims. Maybe they would think, that's my worst nightmare. Somebody coming up and circling me, doing this to me if I'm old and decrepit or out of shape or quadruple bypass patient. And how would I defend myself? I'd be so scared. If I didn't have a knife, I would probably die. I could have just had a heart attack sitting there, or it's a lot harder for me to get up because I'm out of shape or how old I am or whatever it is. So if they start to think that way and start to relate to the defendant, it becomes more likely that there's going to be a not guilty verdict because they also would have been afraid. And if they had a knife, maybe they would have used it in a similar way. So I do think all of that is possible. And I'm not necessarily saying I think the jury is leaning on not guilty. I'm just saying if I were a juror at this point, that's where I would be leaning. But the state still has time to continue to prove up their case. The burden is very high beyond reasonable doubt. It's the highest in the land. So I think it's important for us to remember that as we're continuing to watch the trial, to make sure that the state not only proves that this was a homicide, but that it was not self-defense. They have to prove it was not self-defense. And how can they do that? Well, they can either prove he wasn't in reasonable imminent fear of death or great bodily harm. They can prove he was the aggressor. He started it. He wanted this fight. They can prove that he made bad decisions, that he doesn't have a duty to retreat, but that he either should have retreated or should have stopped the fight or had the opportunity to. And then he started the fight back up again. And then they can also use emotion, right? How sad this is, how sad of a result, how horrible of a result. It's not a result we ever want. How he acted afterwards, didn't care about these kids, tried to hide the knife or ditch the knife, tried to put on his shades and hat and disguise himself and get out of Dodge and just slip out of there without anybody noticing. And then the stories he told that were just absolutely not true. That, again, we're waiting for all this to be kind of tied in a bow from the state. So maybe they're going to, continue building up their case as you would expect as their case continues. But at this point, that's where I land. Let me know if you agree or disagree respectfully in the comments, and let's keep the conversation going. Let's keep learning. Let's keep watching this trial. We'll keep following it. Make sure you guys hit that like button to let me know you're interested and want to keep watching this trial. And I appreciate all the comments and everybody's point of view and position. Thank you for taking the time to do that. Hope everybody has a great weekend. A little bit shorter of a video here because it's Friday night and the mood is right. Everybody have a good weekend. Till next time, I'm out of here. Thanks for watching another episode of The Lawyer You Know. If you enjoyed the episode, please hit the thumbs up and share with your friends who may be interested here on YouTube. And don't forget to subscribe. You can also follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok. And don't forget to check out the Lawyer You Know podcast with new seasons dropping every quarter. If you have a case you want to talk to us about, if it's a personal injury case, wrongful death, catastrophic injury, car accident, or slip and fall case, please email us at lawyeryouknow@gmail.com. And of course, all these links I just mentioned are included in the description below on this episode and every episode. So until next time, this is Peter Tragos, The Lawyer You Know.